Hello and welcome. This is Dawn with the video for Honeybee. Today we're going to be using our stencils in a little different way. So I will be using the new Folk Art Floral stencil in its intended use, and then I'm going to show you some ways to stretch your stencils, especially these pattern stencils. So let's get right into it. Now, like I mentioned, we're going to be using the Folk Art Floral stencil, and then for all of the sentiments, I will be using the Big Time Kindness stamp set and matching die. Now this stencil comes with 4 separate stencils that you layer one on top of the other to create this beautiful pattern. And I've gone ahead and picked out 4 different colors here. I've got Aqua Sky, Buttercup, Grapefruit, and Sprout, all from Concord and Ninth. And then I've got my cardstock already cut down to an A2 size, and I've stuck it here on a sticky mat. I'm going to line up my stencil centered-ish. If it's not perfect, it may drive you crazy. For me, I know I'm going to be trimming this down about 1/4 of an inch, so I'm fine if it's not perfectly centered, but I do want it straight. I'm going to lay that down. The sticky mat is going to hold my cardstock, and if you have a nice, good new sticky mat, it's going to hold your stencil in place too. Mine is used, and it has lost some of its stick, so I'm going to tape mine just to be sure. And for my first card, I am going to use the stencil as intended in its full pattern. So I'm going to speed this up quite a bit just so that we can get through this in a timely fashion. And I'm going to start with that first color, which in this case is Buttercup. I've laid down my stencil and I'm just taking a blending brush and I'm going to go over all of the open areas with that. We're not going to do anything fancy with this. We're going to do very simple color blend. Now, sometimes I do like to come in and hit with just a slightly different color in some areas. And in this point, I'm going to use the grapefruit. And I'm going to take my blending brush and I'm just going to hit the very edges of that center flower. This is completely optional, and you could take this to any level of blending that you wanted. You could create a gradient. You could do a 2-color blend. Again, I was just going for simplicity on this, and I just hit those edges. So I've removed that first stencil and I'm laying down the second stencil. Now all of the stencils are engraved with what they are. So there is no specific order that you need to do this particular stencil set in. You could do them in any order that you want, and I'll show you that here a little bit later. But I'm going to lay down my second stencil and I'm going to use the grapefruit to color in all of those areas. And then I will lay down my third stencil. Now I am rather new to, I've used stencils for a long time, but these layering stencils I am pretty new to. So I like to really explore products when they're new to me like this, even older products we can find new uses for, but I really like to explore them and see how much use I can get out of them, especially these layering stencils that create a pattern. For the most part, you pretty much get what you get what you see, right? You have this pattern that it builds and that's it. But if you just take a minute to really look at that pattern and really explore what you can do with the stencil, you can stretch it way beyond its intended pattern here. And I can't wait to get into those because they're a lot of fun. So here I have put down the final stencil, and this is all of the leaves. And I'm using Sprout to just do the base of the leaves. I used the Sprout for the stems, and now I'm using the Sprout to just do the base of the leaves. This stencil has all of the leaves on it, and now I'm going to come in with the Aqua Sky, and I'm going to go over the entire stencil. What this is going to do is it's going to deepen up and give me a slightly different color where that aqua goes over that green. And this is, again, an easy way to create just a little bit of interest. And now I can just remove that final stencil and reveal my final pattern. I think this is a gorgeous pattern. It is very fun, and I am a huge fan of folk art. Some of my very first sets were folk art sets. So I do have a soft spot for these. So let's work on another one. All right, when you look at a folk art pattern, it is normally a bunch of small patterns repeated to create the larger pattern. So take a look at some of your pattern stencils and try to find the smaller patterns within there. And then you can isolate some of those smaller patterns. So here I'm going to take this little floral motif, I'm going to isolate it, I'm going to stencil it on the top, and then I'm going to mirror it and stencil it on the bottom. So I'm taking my first stencil and I'm using my grid mat underneath. as a guide so that I can make sure that I'm starting my stencil 2 inches from the top and 2 inches from the bottom. So all of my stencils, I'll make sure that they are at that 2-inch mark at the top, and then I'll tape it into place. Again, we're going to speed this up, and I will make sure to slow it down anywhere that I need to give instruction. But for the most part, it is just layering those stencils up one on top of the other, just like you would do for the regular pattern. I am going to do each stencil, top and bottom, before I move to the next stencil, just because I already have the color out and the ink blender out. And for these little areas, and because I'm only doing portions of the stencil, I am using the smaller blending brushes. Okay, so now it is time to line up our second layer. And I'm using that 2-inch mark as my go-to, and then I can slide the stencil into place, lining up the openings with what I've already put down. In this case, those centers of those daisies are my, my guiding point. And just like before, I will flip the stencil to do the mirrored image at the bottom. Now you could find lots of different patterns within your stencils, lots of different isolated little motifs that you could use. I actually have one other version after this one that is really fun. We're going to create a whole new pattern. But this one of isolating a little floral motif is probably the easiest, and I would start with this one if you wanted to really stretch those stencils. Now this is where that 2-inch mark comes in handy. You can see there I was having trouble figuring out where exactly to put this stencil layer, but then I remembered, line the bottom of the stencil up at that 2-inch mark and everything should line up perfectly, and it did. Now here we've got a lot of close open areas that I don't want to stencil over, because remember, we're isolating just this motif. So I've used some Post-it tape, and I'm just masking off all the areas that I don't want to stencil. And then I'll leave all of that in place and then just flip the stencil, bring it to that 2-inch mark, and repeat. Then we're going to move on to our final layer, and our final layer is going to require even more masking. But don't worry, because we're not going to waste what we just used. We're going to reuse all of that tape. We're just going to rip it into smaller pieces. So here I'm going to cover up what I can with the larger pieces. And then for these little areas, I'm going to rip these in half and put them at angles and overlap them until I've masked off everything that I don't want to ink. There we go. Now I can just come in, just like before, I'm going to use that green to hit just the base of the leaves, and then I'm going to move into that aqua and go over the entire leaf. And that again is going to give me that two-toned greenish blue blend on those leaves and add just a little bit of extra, little something something. Leave everything in place, flip that stencil, and repeat. Look at how beautiful that is. So all we did was just isolate that one motif out of that larger pattern. And now we have a whole new design. Okay, so this next one is a little bit more difficult, but we're going to use that same floral motif and we're going to use the portion above it. And we're going to use that stem that's above it as our guide. You see that stem right there? We're going to use that. We're going to line that up in the corner and we're going to rotate and we're going to stencil it in each corner. So in all four corners, using that stem as our anchor point. So we'll line that stem up to where it's pointing at the corner, and then we will stencil everything that's visible. This time we're not going to do any masking off, we're just going to stencil everything that's visible. Okay, this time I'm starting with the stem layer because that stem is going to be my anchor point. It's my guide. I'll make sure that that is directly in the corner of my cardstock. And then I'm going to make sure that the two edges of my pattern, those little stems there that are pointing to the side, make sure that they're lined up and they're just touching the edge of the cardstock. This will make sure that I'm at like a 45-degree angle with that line. So I'll lay that down and stencil in my first layer. Once that's done, I'm going to pick up the stencil and I'm going to rotate it and do the next corner. And then I'll repeat the same process for all 4 corners with this first stencil. I've sped this up considerably because it's repetitive, it's ink blending, to save you guys a little bit of time, and also to let you still see the whole process, to let you still see the pattern come together. Sometimes it can be hard to envision your pattern from the start, and the only way to find out is to try it. So what I like to do when I am experimenting, like in this case, I wanted to try several different patterns, try to remove as many variables as possible, which is why I just went through and did every stencil in the same color pattern. Now imagine how wildly different these cards could be had I chose different color palettes for each one. But again, I just wanted to experiment with the pattern building itself. So by using the same inks and the same color cardstock and all that, I was able to only concentrate on building out the different patterns, and it made it less overwhelming, and it was a lot of fun. This was a lot of fun, and I was surprised. I didn't think that this one was going to work, but this one might have turned out to be my favorite just because it created a beautiful frame around the outside, and you'll see it's just totally different, and you would have never expected that we used the folk art floral stencil to create this background. And another thing that you can do is you can be selective about what you actually stencil here. So I could easily have only stenciled the center flowers there and left the ones on the edges out. I could have swapped out whatever flower was in the middle. I could have went to another flower on the stencil. I could have used another layer and just put it in the center there. There's so many things. I could stop right here. I don't even have to use the last stencil. But for demonstration purposes, and again, because I was just playing random, I just wanted to see what would happen, I'm going to go ahead and use the fourth stencil, which pretty much only ends up being the polka dots. So it does add another color, which I do really like. But again, I could have chosen to use the daisies on there and put them in a different place, just used them like a regular stencil, isolated them and put them wherever I chose to, and built a completely different pattern. So I can't wait to play more with this and see how many more patterns I can come up with. Look at how beautiful that is. Oh, I forgot. I did add in, look, here we go. This is a good example. I added in just that daisy there. I decided to add it to my pattern. Look at that. I just totally forgot that I did that. And then I'm using the stencil to put in the centers. See, I was talking about how you could do it, and I actually did it. I totally forgot. All right, so let's take a look at these 3 finished panels. These were all created from that same stencil, just using the layers in a different way. I think these turned out beautiful, but let's step it up just a notch. I wanted to add some sparkle to the whole thing, so I'm going to use a Sakura Jelly Roll pen here. This is in their sparkle, and I think it's sparkle, glitter, I'm not sure. It doesn't say on the pen, so I can't remember. But I'm going to outline or trace the flowers on this panel. And then on the other panel, I traced all of the flowers and all of the leaves. And on our full panel, I traced everything. So you won't be able to see it here, but I'm going to hold it up to the camera and show you all of the subtle sparkle that this adds, and it is gorgeous. It doesn't photograph worth a hoot, but in real life, it is beautiful. So I have turned down the exposure on the camera here so that you can see some of that sparkle. It shows up so much better when I turn down the exposure and shine a light on it. Look at that sparkle. Oh, so pretty. So I repeated this on all of the panels, and it just adds so much to it. Such a simple thing to do, but it really does add a lot. Okay, for the sentiments, I finished off all cards pretty much identically. I used that Big Kindness stamp set. Big Time Kindness, sorry. I used the Big Time Kindness stamp set, heat embossed in white onto grapefruit cardstock, and then I used the coordinating Big Time Kindness die to cut all of the sentiments out. I also triple stacked all of them, so I die cut them 3 times and stacked them one on top of the other using some honeybee liquid adhesive. And that pretty much finished off the cards. So let's take a look at how they all turned out. So for this one with the all over pattern, I did what I often do and I triple stacked small sentiments, and that way I wasn't covering up too much of the pattern. Now, I don't always worry about covering up the pattern, but here, this is my first time using it, so I did want it to shine. Here's the card we did where we isolated that one motif and then we mirrored it. I love how this one turned out. Again, we used that Big Kindness stamp set and heat embossed it in white onto the grapefruit cardstock, and then I added a few little gold mirror hearts there along with some gold mirror cardstock trim at the top and the bottom. I'm trying to capture that sparkle. It's just really hard unless you turn down the exposure. It's there though, and it's gorgeous. Finally, I think this one turned out to be my favorite because I loved the way we were able to create that frame. Again, we used that same stamp set and die, and then I finished it off with some pearls and some gems, just strategically placing them over the little dots that were in the pattern. So I just used them as a guide on where to place my gems. I'm super happy with how these turned out, and I hope you enjoyed today's video and that it gave you some ideas on how to stretch your layering stencils. Thanks for joining, and I will see you next time. Bye.